Today on The Future of Everything, the future of genetic database privacy. We are in the midst of a revolution in our ability to measure the genetics of individuals. Genetics, of course, is the study of inherited traits. How tall you are, what's the color of your eyes, which diseases may you get in the future, how will you respond to drugs, and other features that you inherit from your parents, grandparents, all your ancestors. Our DNA encodes our genetics. DNA is made of 4 letters, A, T, C, and G, in very long sequences that define our genome. A genome has 3 billion DNA letters. So you get 3 billion from mom in a particular order, and 3 billion from dad, usually a slightly different order, unless they're clones of each other. And we are a combination of mom and dad, mixed to make us related to them, but unique. That's why we have mom's eyes, but dad's nose, mom's healthy heart, but dad's skin problems, or whatever. We are unique, but our relationship to mom and dad, and really all of our relatives, is easy to detect because we share long sequences of DNA that are easily measured by modern DNA sequencing machines. But this raises some privacy issues. We may be interested in learning about our DNA, but when we have our DNA studied, we're learning quite a bit about mom, who shares 50% of her DNA with us, and dad, and our siblings, and even our aunts and uncles and cousins, with less and less DNA shared. So the decision to learn about our DNA is not a totally private decision. It's a decision that impacts everyone who's related. Recently, police arrested the Golden State Killer, a murderer who was found not because he was in the DNA database, but because his relatives, in some cases third cousins, so not that close, but there was enough similarity in the DNA that they could match it to crime scene DNA. And it turns out that a small number of samples in a database is enough to identify many people because of this relatedness. So how can we benefit from genetics, its ability to predict disease, help us respond to drugs, learn about our history, while not setting up databases that will be used by bad guys to violate our privacy? Many people are hesitant to undergo any kind of genetic testing because of this risk. Well, Professor Kuang Xu is a professor of operations in information and technology and electrical engineering at Stanford University. He specializes in using probability theory and optimization to understand how information can be used and in some cases misused. Kuang, you recently proposed a new way to make genetic searches more private while still being accurate. What were the key ideas behind your method?
Great. Yeah. Thanks for asking that question, Russ. So before we get started, I just want to kind of give a shout out to really the true hero behind this work that we're going to talk about today. It's a student I've been working with at the GSB. Her name is Minesu Erturk. And this is really kind of sprung up from her idea, and also another project that she has been doing with a colleague of mine, Professor Lawrence Wang, on actually designing forensic technologies to find potential suspects and targets on the network. So kind of this idea came about when we kind of look at the forensic technology that uses genealogy search and genetics. And then we look at kind of the privacy implication of that search and ask, as we go along and collect more genetic data, how many people are actually exposed? Are we talking about just the number of people that we collect the data from, or there's some kind of spillover effect, as you very well pointed out just now?
And so how did you guys approach this, and what did your results show?
Great. So kind of like, I think the first thing, let me just highlight, as you kind of mentioned, I think the key insight here is that genetic technology, the privacy implication of that is not really an individual concept. Like if you just give your genetic code to some company, it's not just exposing your own genetic information. In fact, you're exposing a lot in your family network. So,
and that makes it, that seems to make it really different. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that makes it very different from like financial bank accounts and stuff, where really it's you and your partner, maybe and your kids, but it doesn't really tell somebody anything about how the financial circumstances of my siblings or my parents. This is very different, isn't it?
Exactly. So, I mean, you could probably draw some like high level analogy with the financial model as well, because maybe people who are related spend the same way, but nothing like this, right? This is hard coded into your literally genes. So you cannot mutate throughout your lifetime. So it is there. And in fact, yeah, it's much stronger kind of a spillover effect than financial markets, financial kind of record. So anyway, so essentially, the problem that we are looking into is this application of a genetic technology called genetic genealogy search. So what we're trying to do here as a searcher is to identify an individual on a social network, like the name, where that person is, where the person is situated in the society. And to do that, you start with essentially a genealogy network or social network that encodes who is related to who, their names, their identity, and such records can be kind of cobbled together either from newspaper obituaries, or some state and governments have actually a digital database that encodes the birth and death record.
Now, I'm interested that you call it a social network, because of course people think about Facebook and Twitter, but you mean that they may be useful as data sources, but you mean the much broader idea of a social network as defined by our relationships of family relationships and other relationships.
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess social network is somewhat of a vague term, but what I really mean is the relatedness, the genetic relatedness, right? People's genealogy network. So so that's kind of like one database you have at your disposal typically, oftentimes it's public. Then the investigator will start with one piece of genetic information they collect either from a crime scene, or in some cases, you want to find a missing parent, then that will be some kind of genetic information you have for yourself, or maybe sometimes you want to identify human remains from an accident. Like many years ago, maybe a murder, some other cold cases. And that's all you got. You have this one piece of genetic information, and this genealogy network, at the beginning, there's no genetic information on genealogy network. Then the second part of the information comes in, which is a database or a collection of genome samples. And these are identified individuals that you can map to nodes on this genealogy network. So from there, the investigator tries to kind of, using triangulation, essentially figure out the similarity between this piece of unknown, like unidentified genome that I have, and to all these known genomes that you have on the network, and then kind of try to work their way in, and eventually you identify the person that's the owner of this piece of genetic information. So
that network, if you're lucky, that network gets you the exact person. But even if it doesn't get you the exact person, it seems to me that it would narrow it down a lot to a small group that then the police or whatever could just go knock on doors and figure out which of them is the likely person.
Exactly. So this is a good segue to maybe mention a little bit about the nuance of the technology and why there's a privacy concern here. So broadly speaking, there are two categories of technologies. There are different acronyms. So one category is called STR and the other called a SNP, SNP. Now, broadly speaking, again, you can think of STR as like a very local kind of information where if you match two pieces of genome, you will know if they belong to the same person, and that's about it. But there's more like a global kind of information you can get from a SNP, where given two pieces of genome, even if they're related over a pretty like long hops, right? Let's say third-degree cousin or something, you can still get some signal that will tell you roughly how they're related. And that's the technology that's really powerful these days to help you kind of zoom in, even though you're not getting an exact match. But that's exactly the kind of technology that might raise issues about privacy.
Great. Okay, so in your paper about these new ways to do matching, you kind of set up this problem. So the worry is that so now it's very easy for somebody to grab my DNA. If they follow me to Pete's Coffee, they can wipe my cup. I mean, and the measurement is really not very expensive. So if somebody was very motivated to get my genome against my wishes, if they're very motivated, they can probably do it. And so you're trying to create these algorithms that will be perhaps a little bit more protective and make it a little bit harder for a bad guy to do the same kind of searches that good guys do to, for helping people, like solving crimes and identifying remains, and the examples or reuniting children, which of course is a very big topic these days. So what is the technical idea that allows you to be a little bit more secure in these algorithms? Maybe you have to explain how the old ones worked so that we can understand the benefit of the new ones.
Absolutely. So the current kind of standard approach essentially was what we call the static approach. So you collect data, genetic data from the population before launching the investigation. So that will typically look like a form of some online website that aggregates data from direct-to-consumer sequencing sites like 23andMe and other services. And then investigators can go to this database and essentially do Google search and input the genome, pull out all the records that are similar to this genome and go from there. So that's what we call a static search. And the hallmark of a static search is you have a huge database already in place. And that's essentially where the problem can start. Now, what we're advocating is a sequential approach.
Okay.
Turns out you can do a lot better if you don't actually begin by collecting everybody's DNA, but you kind of collect their DNA on the fly, sequentially, depending on how much you need, what have you seen so far, and more importantly, depending on the structure of the underlying genealogy network. And that's something that will inform you where to collect data and how to collect the data in such a way that does not kind of expose excessive amount of privacy in the network.
Okay, so now you're, and as I understand it, you're calling this the sequential method versus the static method. Now, even if you have a database, so let's say there's a company, we don't have to talk about specifics, but a company has a database. Can you simulate your method by just asking them for sequences, kind of one at a time, rather than saying, please give me the whole thing? Because please give me the whole thing is stressful for everybody. It's stressful for them because they're giving away literally their primary asset. It might be stressful for the people whose DNA is in that database to know that it's being given out. So can you figure out a way to use your algorithm on an existing databases by asking for information kind of one at a time, or does that not work?
No, definitely. So I think the interaction, you can think about what I just mentioned, sort of you can think about the raw method, which is you have no data, you go to a person and collect data from there, right? But another model you can think about, maybe we have a very secure centralized data set. Now, this is a little bit questionable whether that should be done. And in some countries, that's not even allowed. So in the European Union regulation, you can't even keep that data set. But let's say you do have that one. Then you probably don't want to give it to anyone who's performing the search, everyone who comes to you and perform the search. And instead, you might say, actually, you can imagine an investigator interacting with a database. And this sequential procedure then talks about how this investigator sequentially requests data from the database. So the same kind of math applies.
So paint a little picture for me about what I have my sample. I know that you have a database. I would love to have it, but you don't want to give it to me, but you are willing to do this sequential thing. What would be my first question to you? Like, give me a sample. Like, how would I figure out what you have that might help me identify the Golden State Killer?
Yeah, so for instance, typically in these cases, you don't start with the entire US population. You do some kind of forensic analysis beforehand, and you get a sense of roughly which community, which city the person you're looking for might be in, right? And then the first few questions might be not so informative. You take your best shot and you request their kind of a genetic information. But what's important is at this point, you're not just shooting in the dark. You have a genealogical network. So from there, you can see, for example, oh, wait, so I've collected these 5 people. They collectively cover a lot of people. And the fact that I have not seen a very strong match means it definitely is not in the next 500 people around them. Maybe I should try someone else.
Gotcha. So it tells you who you don't. Yeah, that's great. So it tells you who you don't need to see. Because once you have a sample, you say, okay, I have a pretty good sample of this part of the network. So what you're saying basically is you're going to force the searcher to kind of do their homework and not be lazy. Those are my words, not yours. But it's like, do your homework, come to me with a more focused question, and then I'll work with you in getting a focused answer. And then, of course, if they get a hit, they're happy. But when they, and I guess what you proved in your paper is that the number of records that they have to look at where there's a potential breach of privacy because they're looking at the DNA is much smaller than if you just sent them the whole database.
Right, exactly. So if you do this carefully, kind of in your word, do your homework by tracking how much privacy you're exposing, you can actually kind of strike the perfect trade-off between how many samples you need to collect, because this is typically the cost of actually doing the sequencing, and also how many people you end up exposing by the time you identify the target that you want to find.
Great, got it. So now, first I wanted to ask, is the accuracy of the answer just as good? Because I'm sure people would want to know that. So, would we get the same level of confidence that this is the Golden State Killer, or this is the right match of a separated parents, or are we giving up something in exchange for this privacy in terms of the accuracy?
Yeah, so not really. So it's the same privacy because at the end of the day, you can still perform that STR test to really confirm that indeed this genome belongs to that one person. So the end goal is the same. At the end, you identify the person with very high confidence. It's just along the way how many other people's genome you were exposing without their consent or knowledge.
Great. And so a related question is, these databases exist for many reasons. Some of them are for crime. Some of them are just for ancestry and people want to learn about themselves. Some genetic databases are collected by researchers because they want to discover genetic associations. So they get a bunch of people, they characterize a lot of their traits, they look at their genome, and then they try to say, how can I predict this trait, like eye color or let's say take something a little bit more serious, like risk for disease. Do you think that in the setting of research and discovery, these same methods could be useful? Because you could still worry that, a bunch of academics like you and me have all of this data, and we could be our students might be lax and leave a laptop on a bus or something. And then, so there's some risks. So I'm wondering, do these techniques that you've developed for these other situations, will they also be useful for people who are trying to discover things genetically? Or do we have to open up the full database in those cases?
Yeah, very good question. So I think there are two parts to this, right? So one element of our work, and not just us, actually, there already a community around this, which is to kind of develop a privacy metric of understanding, given this is the data you collected, what is actually the impact? And here's a key takeaway is this kind of a kinship exposure, that this kind of collective impact on people that you never ask consent from. And I think that definitely remains. So one kind of takeaway for us is just think about, well, every time you deal with a set of genetic data, you should probably think about the genealogy network, because you collect data from 5 people. It's not always the same impact. The 5 people from the same family, well, yeah, they're exposing each other. There's still a huge impact, but not as big as like you get 5 random people from across the United States, because then their network is just huge collectively, right?
Yeah.
So that's one element. I think it's just inherent to any time like you are trying to perform analysis on a database. Now, the second part, which is why are you collecting the data? So for us, it's to identify an individual. Now, I do think it's an interesting question. So you might argue that if you wanted to draw some population wide conclusion about some genetic traits impact on predicting diseases, maybe that's not actually effective to stay close to a very small community. That's actually all that we are about, which is don't go around and collect data from random people. But maybe that is necessary for like concluding that there is some kind of an association from Alzheimer to certain genetic traits. So that part is still unclear, and likely you will need a different kind of theory and different understanding for talking about privacy and utility in that setting when genetic data is used differently.
That makes sense. This is the future of everything. I'm Russ Altman, more with Professor Kuang Xu, talking about genetic database privacy, healthcare, and why is this work happening in a business school? Next on SiriusXM. Welcome back to the future of everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Kuang Xu, and we're talking about genetic databases and privacy. So we just went over the recent work that you've done on genetic privacy. And I just wanted to ask, are there any surprises? So everything you said kind of makes sense. Anything during the time you were doing the work where you said, oh, this is not what people may have expected?
Absolutely, yeah. So we mentioned this kind of sequential approach might be better than the static approach, but like at like a more refined level, there are 2 insights that we generated that we thought was really cool. So the first insight, how to do sequential. Well, it turns out it's actually better to expose privacy earlier on than later on. So unfortunately, if you want to do the search, some kind of privacy exposure in the network is unavoidable.
You're going to look at some samples that are they're not the victim, they're not the person you're looking for, and yet you've looked at their DNA, and in some sense, there's a price to be paid for that.
There's price to be paid, but it turns out it's better to pay the price earlier on, because the rationale being like, if you expose them earlier on, you might be able to stop the process earlier. So it turns out that's actually much better to have this kind of a decreasing rate of exposure over time. So I thought that was.
So it's not, is it just better for everybody, or is it also better for that individual who's being exposed?
For everybody, as far as like the total number of people that you will end up exposing when everything is said and done.
Great. So this just falls under the category of don't make assumptions and make sure that the science and the math works out. And this was a surprising finding when you looked at all of that.
Exactly.
Now, what about as you move forward? Will somebody be able to use this in some practical sense to basically make these databases more safe?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's still, this is like a pretty wild west. Like regulation is not quite clear yet for direct to consumer genetics, but we're pretty hopeful. Like I think that at the basic level, one thing that a company can start thinking about is maybe to provide at least a privacy budget or privacy metric and display that as investigators go on, what exactly is the genetic exposure to the entire genealogy network? And that's something we think can be done in the short term. In the longer term, yeah.
Yeah, that's a neat idea. So are you saying that anytime I'm dealing with a genetic database, before I make the decision to get the test or to provide the sample, they might give me a number and I might learn how to use that number comparatively. So say, oh, well, this genetic database is a little bit too risky for my tastes because it gets a score of 100, whereas this other one gets a score of 20 and I like that a lot better. Something like that?
Yeah, exactly. So for example, right now, the standard technique is you upload a genetic code and they give you like an Excel sheet of people that are sort of related to this piece of genetic code. One thing we can think about is you upload a genetic code and then you upload essentially your kind of given certified privacy budget. How many people are you entitled as an investigator or police officer entitled to exposing at the end? Well, then the database can think about that, calculate the optimal set of information to give to you while satisfying this kind of a privacy budget. And that will be a pretty nice step forward.
Yeah, that really does sound kind of controlled. And it leads me to my next question, which is separate from these genetic databases. It seems to me like the ideas that you're capturing here might be very useful in lots of databases. So let me ask you, are you looking at the broader set of questions beyond genetics? I suspect you are, that might benefit from a little bit more control. I mean, many of us are worried about what the social networks know about us, what Google knows about us, what the grocery store knows about us. Do these ideas transfer?
Yeah, so kind of like my background coming from essentially operations research and decision making, I've always been fascinated, as you mentioned earlier, about information manipulation, essentially, right? So we have a lot of debate about privacy. And I think one area that's still kind of ongoing and it's like very exciting now is understanding what's the privacy implication of dynamic operational procedures like the one we just talked about. Now, we've discussed genetic privacy, but I think a broader picture here is whenever you're dealing with collecting data on the network, there are traits that are actually quite correlated and associated throughout the network. Like financial data is another example, even though they're not genetic, but oftentimes they can have very similar spending patterns. So we're actually thinking about whether this model have an implication for how do you access financial data. Maybe my financial data will have privacy exposure risks for my family and relative that use the same credit card or have very similar purchase patterns.
Right.
So that's one, yeah.
So when you take this to companies, are they excited about it or do they roll their eyes and say, oh my God, this is just more trouble for us? What is the attitude of the companies towards these technologies?
I have to say, this is still a very nascent area. I haven't had much chance, and I'm very happy to talk to companies. We get the chance through this podcast. But I think, but by and large in the industry, there's definitely more of a push on privacy now. And unfortunately, I think privacy, just like security, is one of the situations that it's very hard to internalize what exact risk there is until there's a catastrophic event. Finger crossed that we don't have that event. But maybe when that comes, we'll have a more heated discussion and more political will or commercial will to actually implement these solutions.
Have any of the genetic companies shown interest in this work?
Not in this particular work as of yet, but I think this student that we've been working with, the Mines Turk, and her collaborator, Larry, and they've been working with some genetic companies to kind of understand better algorithms for genealogy search. And I really hope the privacy aspect will catch on more as well as we go forward.
So you answered this a little bit a couple minutes ago, but I did want to also just ask again about you are a professor at the School of Business at Stanford, and somebody might not expect genetic databases to be high on the priority list at the business school. So can you tell me, how did you lead to healthcare and genetics as an area of one of your areas of emphasis?
Absolutely. So essentially, there are two branches of my work that sort of intersect and produce this particular piece of work. And one area is I've been thinking about and studying privacy actually for quite some time. And in the context, for example, of machine learning, how would you conduct machine learning in such a way that for an adversary who's observing your data collection procedure, they cannot guess your internal model that you just learned? So actually, these mathematical models bear a lot of resemblance to the model we're talking about today. So there's a whole like a line of work that I'm very interested in privacy in general in operations. I think that's a big problem. Now, another area, it's probably also fairly evident. I think genetics is going to play a very major role in the future of healthcare going forward. And we actually do a lot of research in understanding the best practices, algorithms, and data manipulation procedures in healthcare. So to me, like this is like a very exciting segue into this new domain that we still quite haven't figured out and don't quite understand yet. So genetic for healthcare.
So that's great, and we do have a couple more minutes. So I did look through some of your papers, and in the area of healthcare, there's some really intriguing things. So I just wanted to quickly ask you: you had a paper about waiting time in the emergency room, and everybody can relate to that problem because when you come to the emergency room, pretty much the last thing you want to do, especially since the word emergency is definitely involved, is wait. And yet we've all waited. So tell me, what was that paper, and what did you find?
Yeah, so the main spirit there is to understand that now we talk a lot about using machine learning models to do X and Y and Z. So we were trying to understand if you have a predictive model that gives you some sense of the future congestion levels and arrival and service levels at an emergency room, how do you use that information? And is it really better than not using that information, but do something optimally just given the current state of the world? And turns out you can really gain a lot by kind of planning proactively. And for example, increasing staffing level at the hospital in a very specific way that hits the hospital before the actual peak occurs. And turns out there's a drastic improvement on waiting time compared to the more conventional approach. You wait for the peak to occur, everybody started waiting, then increasing staffing level, but it turns out that's a bit too late. The damage has already been done. And
my guess is that your prediction doesn't have to be perfect in order for it to be useful to those schedulers.
Absolutely. So even if the prediction can be like, for example, noisy up to like 15, 20%, you still see a dramatic improvement in performance.
And then we have about a minute left. So no podcast in 2021 can get by without mentioning COVID. And I did notice that you wrote a paper, I think on detecting potential super spreader events, maybe in Wisconsin. But can you tell me a little bit about your work on COVID?
Yeah, so that paper, actually, we were looking at essentially what's the impact of in-person voting, but with the outdoor environment in Wisconsin.
I see.
And the finding was actually there wasn't much. So it was a very good signal that we should keep social distancing and use outdoor space as much as possible. But that was kind of like a very interesting event where a lot of people voted on the same day, and we looked at data from that day. And turns out there isn't much because most people were queuing outside for hours, but not much time inside. So that was that.
So it was kind of good news that they ran the election in a safe manner.
That's absolutely good news that we should continue to have these gatherings outdoor and with the mask and social distancing as much as possible.
Well, there you have it, the mandatory mention of COVID. But thank you for listening to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. If you missed any of this episode, listen anytime on demand with the SiriusXM app.